3, 2, 1. I rode my bike to the liquor store once to buy a bottle of vodka, and I was so afraid I would smash it that I drank it, the whole thing, and then I got on my bike and cycled home. And it turns out it was a good decision, because I must have fallen off that bike about 10 times on the way home. Definitely would have smashed it. Brothers, sisters, comrades and friends, welcome to Bad Country. Okay, so first things first, apologies for the silly hat. I'm covering up a few injuries after a bike crash. I want to tell you about a man I once met. This is a man I think about very often. His name is Sebastian. Let me set the scene of how I met Sebastian. It was March, so it was very shortly after my birthday, and I was living in Berlin. I had just signed a major new contract with a new client, and then I immediately relapsed. I'd been sober a while, and then after a string of very good positive news, I had a relapse. And that happens with me. I tend to have my worst relapses after the best news. The kinds of things that might cause other people to relapse, like funerals or terrible news, I can take those in stride, but when it's good news, that's when it's dangerous for me. That's when I need to worry. When things are going well. And it was a particularly ugly relapse too. The police were involved, and I'd forced my girlfriend out of the house. She didn't live with me at that time, but she was coming to check on my well-being, and I had forced her out, and she had had an argument with the police as a result. And for about 7 days, I was drinking 1.5 bottles of vodka every day. Eventually, my girlfriend did manage to talk me out of the relapse. She managed to convince me to stop drinking. And I had tried to white-knuckle the withdrawal afterwards. At that point, I'd already been to the psych ward more than 2 times, I think. Around 2 times. And I had no intention of going back. If I was going to have to go through withdrawal, I at least wanted it to be in the comfort of my own home. But in alcoholism, we rarely get the things that we want. And the psych ward was, for me, the very, very last resort. On the second day after stopping drinking, the withdrawal really took bite. It was a difficult one. And due to the compounding and exponential effect of kindling, the process by which withdrawal gets more and more severe every time you experience it, my withdrawals were very severe very quickly at that stage. Even after a relatively brief binge, 7 days is quite a short binge period for me. A week-long binge will lead to 2 weeks of acute withdrawal syndrome, and then 1 month of post-acute withdrawal syndrome or pause, followed by just 3 months of trying to pick up the pieces, trying to repair the damage, put my life back together. 1 week of binge drinking for me is catastrophic. And that's back then. If it happened again today, which it won't, it would be far worse. So I told my girlfriend that I was going to white-knuckle the withdrawal. For those who are unfamiliar, white-knuckling means just going cold turkey, I suppose. It's a sudden stop, and then you just kind of deal with the withdrawal symptoms as they emerge. No medication, no tapering or anything like that. White-knuckling is so called because it's incredibly intense. So I agreed with my girlfriend that we would go to the hospital across the road, where I'd been several times before, go to the emergency department and ask for some lorazepam, some benzodiazepines, just so that I could take them away and then safely detox under my girlfriend's supervision in the relative comfort of my own apartment. That was the plan. And if that failed, if they wouldn't give me the benzos that I said that I needed, then I would go to the psych ward where I'd been before. And the weird thing is that this strategy had worked for me before. I had been to that hospital emergency department and had asked for benzodiazepines to help me with withdrawal, and they had just given them to me and sent me away. And I thought that would work again, but it turns out the person who did that was probably not following the rules, because you're not supposed to do that. I got lucky. Lucky is a relative sense, and I feel like I'm glad that that is not the approved behavior, because that is a power I can imagine someone like me might easily abuse. And so my girlfriend, who was already exhausted by my relapse at that point, agreed to come with me, to chaperone me to the hospital, to at least attempt to find a way to have a comfortable detox at home. Now, these are bad times that I'm recalling. None of this is a good memory. It brings me a lot of discomfort to retell this story or any other story like it. As much as I'm grateful for my girlfriend being willing to accompany me to the emergency room of a German hospital, especially after how terribly I had treated her for the last several days, I would rather none of it had ever happened. I was the worst kind of scumbag that week, as I always am in relapse. Never physically abusive, but cruel and mean and spiteful and manipulative. Just a bad and shitty person. And I remember before we left, I put on a smart shirt. I tried to smarten myself up a little bit after a week-long binge. Tried to look like a normal human for a while so that I would stand a better chance of being trusted by the German doctors. Which means that, in other words, I dressed up to acquire drugs. That's what I did. And I think that's revealing, because what it shows is that while alcohol was my primary problem, I certainly had the capacity for addictive behavior towards all other addictive substances. Dressing up to acquire medication, putting on a show or a performance to go and get benzos is deeply addicted behavior. Alcohol withdrawal of that nature, and in that early stage, before the stage of wanting to climb out of your own skin, it comes in peaks and troughs. You have troughs of abject despair and deathly anxiety, and you have peaks of mania or contentment, even happiness. And when we were going to that hospital, I was in one of those peaks of happiness, I felt charming, although I have no doubt at all that to anybody that I met, I was certainly not actually charming. I think I was just grinning. I was doing that thing where I was being over-friendly and too invested in a conversation, that's being overwhelmingly friendly. But I do know that I was sweating through my shirt, my nice shirt that I'd put on to acquire the drugs. I was already sweating through it by the time I got to the hospital, just from the toxins leaving my body. I was a mess. But I was using my poshest good boy voice, and I was trying to appear normal. But in truth, to anyone that I interacted with, I was doing that weird thing of overcompensating for feeling crap by being too friendly and too interested. It's hard to describe exactly what that's like, but some of you might understand. Anyway, my girlfriend and I were in the emergency room, and I go and talk to the staff, and I tell them that I am an alcoholic and that I'm withdrawing and that I need some benzos to help me withdraw safely at home. There's no point lying to them at that stage. It's not going to help me. I just told them that I had relapsed and was working towards sobriety. I had no previous addiction to benzos. Just give me what I need. Give it to me now. Calm me down. Stop me feeling like I'm about to die. And I'll go and sleep it off. So they tell me to go and sit down and wait for my name to be called. And me and my girlfriend are sat in the waiting room, both exhausted. And we're just talking to each other, probably like having a conversation about what kind of animal each other would be, or, silly stuff. And I hear a voice, and it says, "Excuse me, are you Scottish?" And I look over, and there's a man in his late 50s sat between some strangers across the aisle, and he's speaking directly to me. And at first glance, there was nothing particularly unusual about this man. Nothing that would indicate that he was trouble, except for the fact that he was trying to initiate a conversation with a stranger in the waiting room of the emergency department of a hospital, a place in which most normal people would rather just die on the spot than have a conversation with a stranger. But the closer I looked, the more this interaction went on, the more clues I saw. And looking back, the more obvious it should have been at the time. He was a slim, white man, quite short, with a kind of like skinny, narrow chest and a little distended pot belly. And he was unshaven, but not in a fashionable way, just a scruffy way. And he had the look that he must have been quite a handsome man in his youth. He had a very well-defined jawline, but now there was black dirt in the wrinkles on his face. He was wearing a faded rain jacket, and his jeans were torn over the leg, and one of the soles was flapping off of his trainer, off his shoe. And he had a shoulder bag with a red strap that was in relatively good condition. It looked newer than everything else that he had. And if you saw him on the street, you probably wouldn't think much of it unless you looked a little closer. And when you looked closer, as I did, it indicated a man who was just transitioning into full-time homelessness. Like he was living out of a hostel, perhaps. He hadn't quite lost everything, but he was close. And he asked again, "Excuse me, are you Scottish?" His accent wasn't German, but his English was close to fluent, so I figured from the accent probably Danish. And I assessed him after we'd made eye contact. I assessed him briefly, and I should have ignored him, as everybody else was very obviously doing, but I didn't. I was in that weird, floaty, not happy, but like excitable mood that comes in those peaks and troughs of early withdrawal. That's where I was. It's that moment when I wasn't feeling good. Happy is the wrong word, but at least willing for some reason to engage with this man. And I didn't immediately identify him as being drunk, but my girlfriend did, and I think everybody else did, but I didn't. In my kind of early stages of delusion, I thought he was just interested in me. I thought I was naturally interesting, and a stranger might just reasonably strike up a conversation with me. But no, he was drunk. Very drunk. And getting increasingly drunk as the conversation went onwards. And so I said, "No, I'm not Scottish. I'm from England." And he said, "Ah, England. My name is Sebastian." And he said it kind of theatrically. And since I know that whereas in English we abbreviate Sebastian to Seb, in Nordic countries it's quite common to abbreviate it to Bass. So I said, "Hello, Bass, it's good to meet you." And I said it in that over-friendly way. I said, "Bass, it's a pleasure to meet you." And with that tone of familiarity, I had opened the door for Sebastian to tell me his life. My girlfriend, who was already shaken by the events of the last few days, pulled out her phone and looked at it and didn't look up again for the rest of the time. I wish I'd done the same. She was smarter than me in that moment. Everybody else was, to ignore this guy, who must have been causing a problem before I even arrived, from the body language of everybody else. But I wasn't in the right mind. I was in the early stages of delusional withdrawal. It would get far worse pretty quickly. But at that moment, I wasn't reading the situation for what it was. And I felt an immediate, if false, connection with this guy. He asked me what I did for a living, and I told him I was a writer, which is not strictly true, but it's easier than saying I sell dildos for a living, which is true, but is difficult to say to a stranger. And that got him excited, the idea that I was a writer. And he asked me what books I'd written, and I told him about Just Crazy Enough to Work, my book about my descent into alcoholism. And he was very interested, and he started reeling off authors and books that had had a major emotional impact on him. His gestures grew bigger and grander with every one. And he mentioned Catch-22, which is a book that's also very important to me. I have it tattooed on my wrist. And I tried to interject with my own love for that particular book, but he just talked right over me, just kept listing books that he'd read, authors that he admired. And I began to realize that I wasn't really in a conversation at all. He was just set to broadcast and not to receive, and that this wasn't really the friendly interaction that I thought it was. But being British and therefore too socially awkward and polite to try to stop the interaction, I just kept trying to turn it into a conversation. He just ploughed on broadcasting, and I ploughed on trying to have a conversation. And at that point, it was just two fucking drunks having a very loud conversation about different things in a hospital waiting room in front of a group of very uncomfortable strangers. And occasionally he might have a moment of self-awareness, and he would suddenly apologize for interrupting the conversation my girlfriend and I were having. Or he could see that he was making my girlfriend uncomfortable, and he would apologize, and he would move to come over, and I would stop him and make him sit back down. And then he might go quiet for a while, and I would watch him out the corner of my eye, pick up my conversation with my girlfriend, but watching him too. And I would watch him reach into his shoulder bag and surreptitiously open a bottle of lurid green peppermint schnapps, and discreetly, disguising it behind his forearm, take a big swig. And I knew what that drink was. I knew it was green peppermint schnapps because it was the cheapest strong liquor available from the Aldi across the road from the hospital. And I knew that because I had also drank that horrible fluid to excess. And I knew how potent it was and how dangerous it is. And he was drinking it in the hospital waiting room. And then a couple of minutes after that swig, after he'd been quiet for a moment, I would see his body language begin to become impatient, and his leg would twitch. And then all of a sudden it had to come out of him, and he would blurt out some new thought in my direction, some book that he remembered, some quote that he found powerful, some piece of writing that meant something to him. He would say it, he would broadcast it to me. And at that point, I was still willing to engage with him. My girlfriend tells me that I'm too willing to do that even in sobriety, to give time to people that perhaps I shouldn't, or to indulge people more than I should. And I find that to be a fine characteristic, but when I'm coming off alcohol, or particularly when I'm still drunk, I'm terrible for it. I will speak to anybody about anything at length. And at first I thought Sebastian was an interesting character, somebody worth listening to. But he wasn't. And the more he spoke, the more and more absurd this situation became. He initially said that he'd worked for a Danish production company, a TV and movie production company. And that evolved into working with Mads Mikkelsen, the Danish actor. And that evolved into Sebastian was himself an actor. And that evolved into, eventually, into him performing Shakespeare with Ian McKellen on stage. And that culminated in him, I swear this is true, as absurd as it sounds, that culminated in him performing Shakespeare directly to me in that emergency room waiting area. He performed this surreal, grandiose soliloquy from Hamlet. He even walked, before he began, he walked to the corner of the room and really got into character for it. And then he turned and took a moment and he came out bombastic and theatrical and full of hyperbole and exaggerated. It was extremely absurd. And there must have been a kernel of truth. There must have been some piece of truth in the center of the lies he was telling me. Because he did know Hamlet. And you don't tend to know that kind of thing by accident. You don't acquire that by osmosis. There must be a reason why he knew it, so I suspect there probably was some acting in his background. It was more the surreality of the moment itself, to have Shakespeare performed directly at you, loudly and theatrically, by an alcoholic to an alcoholic in a hospital waiting room. And at that point, it stopped being interesting and had become grotesque, even to me. Everyone else in the waiting room had looked away long before I did. But when he came out booming this Shakespearean monologue, it woke everybody up and people felt threatened because it was so out of place. At that point, even to me, who was there to beg for drugs, this seemed obscene somehow. It had developed beyond exaggeration and harmless, pointless lies. It was now ugly. And he bragged loudly and ostentatiously about the actors he had worked with while his trousers were falling down and revealing greying pubic hair and dimpled buttocks. He was proudly shouting about his accomplishments while his trousers were falling down. And at the end of that soliloquy, he even bowed as if to accept the rapturous applause of the audience. He had that magnanimous smile on his face that actors have when they hear the cheers for encore. It was a grim spectacle. He wasn't lying anymore. He was divorced from reality. But it wasn't a delusion or an hallucination. It was something that I had never seen before, like a grandiose, narcissistic delusion. For me, for my benefit, well, for his, I suppose, but I was the intended audience. And let me put it this way, if I were to write a novel with a fictional scene in it in which an alcoholic performs a Shakespearean soliloquy while holding up his pants in the waiting room of the emergency department while he is seeking treatment after having fallen off a train station platform onto the rails, which is why Sebastian was there, you would tell me that that scene is too on the nose and that my metaphor was not subtle enough. You would say I was being too obvious with my symbolism, and you would say it was not believable. But it happened. And that happened. And that was Sebastian. And by the time my girlfriend and I left, security had been called. I think about Sebastian a lot, because Sebastian, even today, makes me deeply, deeply uncomfortable. You can perhaps guess where I'm going with this. There was something very haunting about Sebastian for me personally, because I can imagine it would only take a couple of bad decisions for that to be me. I can easily, too easily, see myself as Sebastian performing Shakespeare drunkenly in a hospital waiting room. I have no doubt that Sebastian probably was an interesting man once, probably charismatic, probably really some acting experience of some kind, may really have worked for a production company at some point in his history. He was intelligent, I think, or was, and was certainly well read. But it was a long time ago. Sebastian is my ghost of Christmas future. And those things that Sebastian was saying, I can imagine myself saying. And the more he drank in the waiting room, the more those half-truths turned into insurmountable exaggerations. And those exaggerations became outright impossible lies. Like, for example, he told me that he was given a bouquet of flowers by Ian McKellen, who was crying bitter tears of professional admiration as he presented them. And Sebastian makes me nervous to this day, because I am also a person full of stories, and a person who presents themselves as having lived a little bit. And it's not difficult for me to fast forward the tape of my own life, add in one more bottle of vodka, that's all it would take, skip forward 20 years, and I am Sebastian. And I am the person bragging about my accomplishments while holding up my pants. It was the first time I'd ever seen such grandiose delusions firsthand. I've read about them. I'd read about them being possible, especially with alcoholism. But I didn't really know what it meant until I saw it. And I saw that what it means is a complete detachment from reality until the lies that you're telling are not lies anymore, really, because you have no relation to the truth. And to see it myself, in fact, not so much see it myself, but have it personally directed at me, was very disquieting, because I could see some of my alcoholic behavior reflected in Sebastian's in a small way. When I was drunk, I would habitually lie to strangers, especially taxi drivers. I would just make stuff up to make me seem more interesting than I really was. Pointlessly. Stupid stuff that no rational person would possibly believe. Tiny kernels of truth were suddenly expanded into gigantic spiraling lies, like I worked for MI6 and was trained by Mossad, when the truth is that I had once applied to work for MI6 after I graduated and never heard back. And I wasn't trained by Mossad, but I did once train with somebody who was in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. But I had expanded those out for the sake of impressing a taxi driver. And that's not to demean taxi driver. The insult there is against me, not the taxi driver. And I would occasionally, if I was in a bar or a pub on my own, I would lie to the bar staff, or I would try to imply that I was obscenely wealthy, but was trying to hide it, you know? Like I would try to pretend to be secretly rich. Or I would brag about visiting countries that I'd never been to. For what reason? My life was interesting. I had an interesting life. Why did I lie about it? It's because I don't know why. If you know why, please do leave a sense of it in the comments, because I would love to know the theory behind this stuff. Like, why lie when you don't need to? And I would frequently recycle other people's stories as my own. Like, if I met someone who was interesting and they told me an anecdote, it was very common that after I'd been drunk enough, I would go and relay that story again as if it was my own. Or I would tell jokes that I'd seen on TV the night before and pass them off as my own, that kind of thing. Really gross behavior, stuff that I would never do sober, not even back then when I was young. But it all just blurted out in alcoholism. Lies that just don't serve a purpose, that don't serve me, that are easy to see through. Why? And I have a sense that that is how Sebastian started out. I believe that there was a kernel of truth in some of his stories, and then in alcohol he had just expanded them out and was telling other people's stories as though they were his own. And the problem is, he had been doing that for 30 years or so. And after that period of time of lying in alcoholism, it's not so much lying as it is not knowing what the truth is anymore. And that was the risk, I think, that I face when I look at Sebastian and I see myself in the future. And those kinds of lies, when they're no longer the small lies that are common to all alcoholics, like I've only had 2 drinks when you really had 7. These were grand spiraling lies, the ones that he was telling and the ones that I also used to tell. Grand spiraling lies that are obviously lies, but also unintentionally revealing. And what they reveal is a sense of sadness about yourself, a sense that you are not interesting enough, or that you are inadequate. And in alcohol, you vastly overcompensate. Those kinds of lies, those big lies, what they speak to is a sense of unfulfilled potential. And that is one of my biggest fears. And in recovery, when you spend time with other people in recovery, you learn to spot who has a good chance of turning things around and who has already gone too far. And Sebastian, I'm afraid to say, was one of those people who'd already gone too far. He reminded me of Withnell from Withnell and I, except without Withnell's charisma. And one suspects that if Withnell lived long enough, then he too would lose that charisma. And that's where Sebastian was. And that's where I see myself going if I play the tape out far enough. And that image of Sebastian performing this grotesque, theatrical version of Hamlet, holding up his trousers in the hospital waiting room, that is what is waiting for me if my resolve to be sober so much as weakens for a moment. Okay, so what about you? Do you have a "there but for the grace of God go I" moment? Leave it in the replies, leave it in the comments. And if you like this kind of long form, low fidelity, sober content, please do subscribe. Thank you for watching. And as always, good luck out there.